Good evening. My name is Candace, and I'm an event manager. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation with David Wessel. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're so glad to have you joining us virtually tonight. The presentation will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To submit your questions for the Q&A portion of the event, please enter meet.ps/Wessel or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks of where to go once we get to Q&A. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. You can help us get to more by keeping your question concise. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Beth Novak with her practical guide to solving public problems, and Ryan Buse on how the gun industry radicalized America. Visit our website and join our email list to get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, and Wincoat Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I want to thank all of the members tuning in tonight. If you share in Town Hall's vision of a community strengthened by discussions about civics, science, and culture, where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us tonight by donating or becoming a member. And lastly, you'll want to dig deeper into tonight's topic by purchasing a copy of Wessel's book. Please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place Books. And now for this evening's talk. David Wessel is director of the Hutchins Center on Fiscal and Monetary Policy at the Brookings Institution, with 30 years of experience as a reporter, editor, and columnist at the Wall Street Journal. He is a New York Times bestselling author and shares 2 Pulitzer prizes, one for Boston Globe series in 1983 on the persistence of racism in Boston, and the other for stories in the Wall Street Journal in 2002 on corporate wrongdoing. His new book, Only the Rich Can Play: How Washington Works in the New Gilded Age, is the subject of this evening's talk. Please join me in welcoming David Wessel.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. I have to say that when I started this book, I thought it would be a great excuse to travel around the country, and I was looking forward to doing things in person at places like Town Hall and Third Place Books or Third Street Books, and I'm really sorry that this has to be virtual, but I hope sometime to be back in Seattle. My son is engaged to a woman who grew up in Seattle, so I'll have new excuses to visit there with his new family. This is a book about something called opportunity zones, and opportunity zones were a provision slipped into the 2017 tax bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that led to the creation of 8,764 tax havens across the country. And the deal is that if you're rich and you have some capital gains, that is profits from the shares of stock or property or art or whatever, you can sell that. You can put the profits into an opportunity zone. You get a break on the capital gains tax on that initial profit. And when you put the money into an opportunity zone investment and you hold it for 10 years, you can escape capital gains taxes altogether. And as one tax lawyer I know says, there are other ways to avoid capital gains taxes, but this one has a big advantage. You don't have to die first. So in some respects, this is a story, as the subtitle suggests, about how Washington works in this age of great wealth. It's also a story about an attempt to use the tax code as a weapon of social policy to get rich people to put money into communities that need capital, into poor communities. And it's a story, I think, about how aggressive the tax lawyer, accounting, wealth management, real estate finance industry is at taking advantage of any opportunity that the tax law gives them to cut taxes for their clients. So as we go along, I hope you'll feel free to put questions in the chat. If they come up, I might pause and answer them along the way, but certainly when I finish my little talk, I hope you'll ask some questions. And if there's something that you're curious about what's going on in Washington now about economic policy, about the budget or the pending bills in Congress, Build Back Better or the reconciliation bill, or what the heck the Federal Reserve is doing, I'm happy to talk about those as well. I know less about foreign policy, so if you ask me about Afghanistan, I'm going to duck. But that said, I hope you'll feel free to ask questions on opportunity zones, on the story I'm going to tell you, and on economic policy questions in general. Okay, so how did this provision find its way into the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? And unlike a lot of other tax incentives, tax breaks, this one did not stem from some think tank in Washington or the policy shop of some political campaign or one of those trade associations of Washington lobbyists that populate the city. This began with Sean Parker of Napster and Facebook fame, the guy who Justin Timberlake played in The Social Network. And Sean Parker, who got very rich on Facebook, even though he was booted out of the company after only a couple of years, like a lot of people in Silicon Valley, rich people in Silicon Valley, he's pretty much convinced that he has a better idea for doing almost everything. And he thought he could, his words, hack the system in order to get money to left behind places, poor communities across the country. And so Sean Parker toyed with this idea. He consulted lots of people. He likes to be chatting with smart people. And when you have a lot of money, it's not hard to get them to come to talk to you, or you go talk to them. And he originally asked a guy named Ro Khanna, who's now a congressman, who'd been in the Obama administration, to lead up his campaign to get opportunity zones into law. But Khanna said, I'm not interested in that. I want to run for Congress, which he did, failed the first time and won the second time, and is now a member of Congress representing Silicon Valley. But Khanna suggested he talk to a guy named Steve Glickman, who had been in the Obama White House, a Democrat, a former Senate staffer, and John Lettieri, who was then working for a trade association that represents US units of foreign corporations, also a former Senate staffer, a Republican. And he basically asked them to start a little think tank called the Economic Innovation Group and help him get his idea, a tax break to get rich people to put money into poor neighborhoods, enacted into law. And Glickman and Lettieri were very clever. They didn't issue a press release when they formed their think tank. They didn't set out a roadmap for what they wanted to do. They went into stealth mode for a couple of years and organized a very smart and accurate campaign to point out the amount of geographic inequality in the United States. There had been at the time a lot of talk, we're talking 2015, 2016, a lot of talk about income inequality, the gap between the people who make a lot of money at the top, the Bill Gateses and Jeff Bezoses of the world who live in your neighborhood, and the rest of us. But they were focused on geographic inequality, the fact that some communities in the country have done pretty well, Seattle, Portland, Washington, DC among them, and others have done really poorly. And the gap between those was widening. And this was actually, it's true, they didn't say anything that was not true, but what they did is they lay the foundation for raising the visibility of a problem, geographic inequality, to which they just happened to have a solution in their back pocket, this opportunity zone thing. And then they realized that unlike a lot of other campaigns to get things done in Washington, it would be important to build a bipartisan political base for their idea. So they went around and collected support from a number of Democrats and Republicans. I don't think most of them really understood what the proposal was, but it kind of sounded good. Who could be against doing something that would encourage rich people to put money into poor communities? And key to their move was they recruited two prominent senators, both new to Washington, both African Americans, Cory Booker, who had been the mayor of Newark, a Democrat, and Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, who'd been a congressman, but before that, a local official. And Scott and Booker had previously teamed up on an apprenticeship bill, and it was unusual enough to see a Democrat and a Republican sponsoring a bill together. And there was a certain fascination with these two Black senators that they got a lot of attention for introducing a bill, which usually nobody even notices. And they became very key to the creating the bipartisan aura about this idea. And then because they wanted to build intellectual respectability for this, they turned to two prominent economists, one a Republican, one a Democrat. The Republican is Kevin Hassett, who later ended up as chair of President Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. The Democrat is Jared Bernstein, who had been an advisor to the vice president and is now a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors. And they did a white paper, which basically said that geographic inequality is a problem, and previous attempts to use what are known as place-based policies hadn't worked very well. They didn't lay out the details of opportunity zones, but they kind of gave it a very high-level sheen. These are recognizable economists in Washington, and it led people to think, people who paid attention, that is, this must be an interesting proposal. You got a Democrat and Republican in the Senate, and you got a Democrat and Republican economist. So there must be something to this. And so they gradually built a coalition, and they had lots of sponsors in Congress. They eventually introduced this bill. It's called the Investing in Opportunity Act in 2016. And it went nowhere, but they were moving it along. And one reason they had some success is that Sean Parker is an incredibly engaging person. John Lettieri told me, the guy from Economic Innovation Group, that when he brought corporate CEOs around to meet members of Congress, they knew they had to do it, but they hated every minute of it. Sean Parker, in contrast, really enjoyed it. And he enjoyed learning about the differences between the way an office in the House works and an office in the Senate. And at the same time, this being Washington and Sean Parker being realistic, he started increasing his campaign contributions. And instead of giving them all to Democrats, which had been his habit, he started diversifying and gave them to Republicans. And campaign contributions are kind of a door opener. People listen to you. When someone says, I'd like to bring Sean Parker by to meet you, and your staff looks up Sean Parker and sees his campaign contributions, chances are, even if you don't know who he is, you think, oh, I'll take this meeting. And they're also a thank you, a way of thanking people who were supporting him. So they had this piece of legislation, largely written by the people at the Economic Innovation Group and the consultants they hired, was very carefully written to be attractive to rich people. And as the bill iterated, as they worked on it, it became more attractive to rich people. And was devised in ways I can explain if you really want to know, to make it look like it didn't cost very much over 10 years. And the reason that's important is Congress thinks in 10-year estimates. And whenever anybody proposes something, they look and see what's the 10-year price tag. Well, this bill has a peculiar feature that the people who participate have to pay some taxes in 2026. So there's a big bump in 2026 of income to the Treasury. And most of the losses come after 10 years. You have to hold the property for 10 years. And that doesn't show up in the kind of calculation they generally do. So the bill is proposed. They get some attention. They have a very clear view of how Washington has gone wrong in the past. And the basic view is that previous programs to get rich people to put money into poor neighborhoods have had too many rules and too many bureaucratic hurdles to cross. So there's one called the New Markets Tax Credit, for instance, that the Treasury administers. Congress set a cap on that. And because there's a cap, there's more people who want to take advantage of this, and the Treasury gets to decide who gets the money. Opportunity zones have no cap, and opportunity zones have no requirement that the money be used to benefit the people in a community, because they thought if you make the program broad, you get a flood of money, and some of it will go to projects that probably don't deserve it, but most of it will go to deserving projects. I don't think it worked out that way, as I'll get there in a minute. So in 2016, the Republicans were in control of Congress, and they had a Republican president. And the Senate Republicans suffered an embarrassment when they failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. You may remember that famous moment where Senator John McCain from Arizona voted thumbs down. They have failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And so that put a lot of momentum behind their plans for what they called tax reform. And that had been percolating behind the scenes. I thought they had no chance of getting tax reform through, because I thought it takes a lot of time and a lot of consensus building to get tax reform, but they were doing a lot of work. And when the ACA repeal went down, they really felt like they had to do something to justify their existence. So tax reform became their priority. And there were 4 senators on the Senate Finance Committee, which writes tax bills, that were key. And one of them was Tim Scott. And Tim Scott made sure that this was included in the draft of the tax bill that was considered in the Senate. There were never any hearings, and it wasn't really vetted or scrutinized by the usual way that these programs are looked at, because no one really took this seriously, and no one knew that he had slipped it into the bill. He did have one lucky break, though, or maybe he made his own luck. In August 2017, the bill is beginning to move through the corridors of Congress, and the White House is very involved in negotiating the bill, but they're fixated on lowering taxes on corporations. And although there are a couple of champions of opportunity zones in the White House, including Kevin Hassett, who I mentioned earlier, and a guy named Jerome Smith, who's in the White House Office of Domestic Policy, the economic policy people who are working on the tax bill, this was nowhere on their to-do list. Then in August 2017, you may remember there was violent protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, over a Robert E. Lee statue. And some white nationalists protested the protesters who wanted the statue to come down, and one of them even drove a car into a set of people, and a woman died. And so President Trump was asked about this, and he said there were very fine people on both sides, white nationalists and neo-Nazis on one side, people who wanted to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee on the other. Well, this was too much for Tim Scott, and he was very vocal in public, in the press, saying this was not right. There were not fine people on both sides, and we deserved better moral leadership from the White House. The White House invited Tim Scott down to meet with Trump. Scott was prepared for a confrontation. He told Trump why what he said was so hurtful. Trump was very conciliatory. This is according to Tim Scott. I never talked to Donald Trump in my life. And at one point, the president says to Tim Scott, "What can I do to make up for the harm I've done to people who I've offended?" And Tim Scott says, "You can support my opportunity zone bill." He was ready for that question. The next day on Air Force One, the president says, he's asked about his meeting with Tim Scott, and he says, "Whatever that tax thing is that Tim Scott has, sounds like a good idea, I'm for it." And suddenly the White House was behind it as well. So the combination of Tim Scott writing the tax bill, participating in the writing of the tax bill, and the White House behind it, this thing becomes law. The law is passed. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed by this process called reconciliation, which you may have heard of recently. And one of the details of reconciliation, which allows a bill to pass the Senate with only 51 votes, not the 60 that's usually required, is that any provision that doesn't raise or cost money gets stripped out. And in this case, what was stripped out was the requirement that opportunity zone money, that there be reports to the Treasury, and the Treasury report to Congress. So that reporting was stripped out. So the law passes. the Trump Treasury has to write rules for it, and they generally write rules that are pretty taxpayer favorable. But the law said that the Treasury had to come up with a list of census tracts that were eligible, that were certain criteria. And the Treasury came up with a list of census tracts that represent 56% of all the census tracts in the United States. And then governors had to decide which ones of those would be designated with this special tax treatment. And the governors were allowed to pick up to 25% of those zones. Some governors picked wisely, some were corrupt, and some picked foolishly. So, for instance, in New York State, 25% of the opportunity zones are in Brooklyn, New York, which basically doesn't need any new incentives. In Austin, Texas, one of the fastest growing metro areas in the country, the city asked the state to give them 4 opportunity zones. The governor gave them 21. And that's another place that doesn't really need the incentives, in my opinion. And that's important because what happened is there's 8,764 tax havens across the country. And if people who are investing money, most of it in real estate, are looking for places to put money, they're naturally going to pick the kind of best off of these opportunity zones. On average, opportunity zones are poorer than other communities in America, but the money is going to the best off communities as best we can tell. So how do I get interested in this? Well, as Candace mentioned, I left the Wall Street Journal 7 years ago to go to Brookings, which is a think tank in Washington. And one of my colleagues came into my office one day and he was just fascinated by this opportunity zone provision in the Tax Cut and Jobs Bill, which I had never heard about. And in fact, this thing was done so quietly that the first story in any major newspaper didn't appear until a month after the bill was signed into law by the president. There were so many bigger tax provisions in this bill that no one paid attention. And when my colleague, Adam Looney, mentioned that Sean Parker was involved, the reporter in me got interested because, give me a break. When do you get to write about a tax provision that starts with a guy like Sean Parker? So I heard about an opportunity zone expo in Las Vegas at the Mandalay Casino and Resort, Mandalay Bay Casino and Resort. This is in May 2019. I'm thinking there might be a book in this. I'm not sure. I haven't cut a deal with a publisher, but I'm also thinking that if I do the book and I didn't go to this Opportunity Zone Expo in Las Vegas, I would forever kick myself. In the back of my mind, I had that, I remembered all those great scenes in the movie The Big Short, which some of you may have seen. So I go to the Opportunity Zone Expo at the Mandalay Bay, and it is like going to a modern day gold rush. There are hundreds of tax lawyers and accountants selling their services, wealthy people looking for a way to cut their taxes, real estate developers looking to raise money, and everything in between. There's one guy, the first day I walk in, and there's this guy with a big cowboy hat and a white paper wrapped around it that says looking for opportunity zone money. Turns out his name is Robert White. He's in the business of packaging liquor, contract packaging, and he was interested in raising money to move his factory and was willing to move it to an opportunity zone. I met a guy who had at the exhibit hall little tiny green plants. And it turned out he was working for a company that builds vertical gardens that grow lettuce in urban areas. And they were looking to get opportunity zone money to expand. I asked him, when did you start this opportunity zone prospecting? And he said, yesterday. Robert White never got any money. And this guy from this urban garden, vertical garden thing, he left the company and they never raised any money either. And then I sat down next to a woman, and believe me, this is a reporter's dream. Hundreds of people who are all extroverts who just love to talk to you, even though you tell them you're a reporter and you're writing this down in your notebook. I meet this really nice woman. She's from LA. I asked her why she's come to this thing. She said she was asked by a friend to run his Opportunity Zone real estate fund, but she had decided not to do it. I said, oh, why did you decide not to do it? She said, well, I made a lot of money in real estate. I already have a boatload of money. I don't need any more. I said, okay, why are you at this Opportunity Zone Expo? And she explains that in the mid 80s, she bought an Andy Warhol painting. And the painting was now worth a couple $1,000,000 more than she'd paid for it. And she was thinking of selling the painting and investing the proceeds in an opportunity zone to avoid the capital gains tax. I wasn't smart enough at the time to ask her what it was a painting of, but I followed up with her later and I said, by the way, I never asked you what it's a painting of. $3 signs, she tells me. I've actually seen the painting. There's an Andy Warhol painting of $3 signs. Now, she didn't end up selling the painting either. She decided to leave it to her kids. And my wife said to me, well, how are you going to get that into the book? And I said, that's such a good story. The narrative will bend wherever it needs to go. So I decided to do the book. And the first half of the book is telling the story that I just told you about how this became law. I'll draw some lessons from that in a minute. But then the second half of the book was my attempt to figure out, okay, where did the money go? And what I found, there's no good data. There's a little data now. An economist at the Joint Committee on Taxation in Congress got a look at 2019 tax returns, and he found that 85% of the opportunity zones got no money, and half the money went to the 1% of zones, the best of zones, New York, LA, Phoenix, places that, as you would expect, were growing pretty rapidly. So I've been accused of anecdotal reporting, and that's true because without data, what reporting is anecdotal. And what I spent a lot of time, not in Seattle, but in Portland, Oregon, where the state designated most of downtown as an opportunity zone and a lot of rural poor neighborhoods as opportunity zones. They made a choice, a deliberate choice. They said, if we put only opportunity zones in the worst parts of the state, they won't get any money. And if I put all the opportunity zones in the parts that are already getting money to give them a little more, we got a lot of bad publicity. So they did both. They got bad publicity. And so in downtown Portland, there's a Ritz-Carlton hotel and condo complex going up with opportunity zone money. I don't think that was the intent of the program. There's an immigrant community outside of Portland, all those small houses built after World War II. It's called Rockwood. They are an opportunity zone. They tried very hard to get money and they didn't get very much. And I spent time in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore, Maryland is a real basket case of a town. It's unfortunate because it has a lot going for it. It's close to Washington, D.C. It's on the East Coast corridor, has a big university in Johns Hopkins, but it has miles and miles of really lousy neighborhoods. And so what I found in Baltimore is there's some opportunity zone money, but not very much, despite a concerted effort by the community there, and a foundation funded an opportunity zone czar. And then as I reported this more, I discovered that because the rules are so lax, there's some really outrageous things going on with opportunity zone money. There are self-storage facilities going around. The law does forbid doing a few things. You can't do a golf course, you can't do a liquor store, you can't do a massage parlor, but there's nothing to stop someone from putting money into self-storage. And there's an industry of building self-storage, and this is cheap money for them. And they employ next to no people. In fact, I found one in Dillon, South Carolina, that literally employs nobody. It's totally automated. And then there's luxury student housing going up in a number of college towns, Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, Louisville, Kentucky, because census tracts that have a lot of college kids show up as poor because they don't have any income. And that's clearly ridiculous. But to be fair, I found some examples of people who were using opportunity zones for exactly what the proponents said they would be used for. There's a really interesting outfit in LA called Sola Impact, founded by a guy named Martin Wodo, who's an immigrant from Nigeria that's doing affordable housing, was doing affordable housing before, realized that opportunity zone money would allow them to do more. And so he's raised a big opportunity zone fund of $115 million. So, and I have other instances as well. Opportunity zones can be used for good. The problem is there's nothing to require them to be used for good. There's no oversight. And you don't even have to say you're helping a local community. There's no provision that you get extra credit if you're creating jobs or any requirement that you create jobs. There's no requirement for community involvement except from the local zoning. And so what I fear has happened here, and I think the evidence that we've seen so far supports it, is that with 8,764 opportunity zones, naturally, wealthy, tax-averse investors looking for the highest return on the lowest risk are investing in real estate in places that are already going up. Some of them are gentrifying, some of them just are less poor than they were when the data was put together. There are some operating businesses that are getting opportunity zone money. And interestingly, Sean Parker, when he conceived this, he had in mind not real estate, but he had in mind helping to get small entrepreneurial businesses funded, helping them get capital in places that are off the East and West Coast. But the program is not well designed for that. And although there is some of that, I think it's not the bulk of this. So I want to caution that these are conclusions. I mean, I wrote a book, I believe them, but they're early because COVID disrupted investment of all kinds. And it may take a few years to see how this shakes out. I hope we'll get the data. The Trump Treasury could have demanded more data from Opportunity Zone funds. President Biden in his campaign promised to reform the funds, but the Treasury has not done anything. And there's no legislation at the moment in any of these bills to do this. So I'm happy to talk about ways in which I think they are used well, but my concern is no requirement for that. That's not happening. So let me draw three lessons that I want to respond to some of the questions that have come in. One is it's okay with me that a rich guy like Sean Parker, just like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, has an idea for how we ought to shape public policy for some purpose other than lining their own pocket. It is not okay, though, that they basically hire their own think tank to write the law and lobby it into law. I don't think that they were evil. I just think they were naive and arrogant about the way they went about it. And so they wrote something that's being exploited for purposes that I don't think were the stated purposes. Sean Parker told me that he has not invested his own money in an opportunity zone. And I believe him. And he does that. He did that on purpose. And so that's that. Secondly, it's really important for people like me, but also people like you to pay attention to what's going on these bills, particularly important for the press. Because when you get a huge bill with 2,000 pages, there could be 5 pages in it that are doing something like this, creating a new way for rich people to avoid paying taxes, and nobody notices until it's too late. And third, it may be really hard to use the tax code to get wealthy people to steer money into places where Congress decides it should go. It's not a very efficient way to direct things. I come away with this thing kind of disappointed that Washington works in a way that an idea which has some merit, how do we get private money into poor neighborhoods, gets so distorted in the process that it ends up being, on balance, doing more to cut rich people's capital gains taxes than doing good for the people in America's communities that really do need the help, that our capital stars need the help. Someone asked, how can you look up these zones in Seattle? I don't know very much about Seattle. There are 10 zones in Seattle. If you Google Opportunity Zone map, there's a company called Novogradic that has a map, and there's a company called CohnReznick, and you can type in an address and see where the opportunity zones are in Seattle. There are some opportunity zone investments in Seattle. There's a logistics facility in the Sodo neighborhood, the $43 million one, and there's some multifamily housing, 225 apartments going up at 12th and Yester. I found those by Googling around. One frustrating thing is that you don't really, if a project's going in to a neighborhood that's designated an opportunity zone, but you don't know if it's using the opportunity zone tax break unless the people who are doing it tell you. There's no, sometimes it comes out in public disclosures, but mostly you have to ask them. Sometimes they'll tell you, sometimes they're not. Some of the big funds that organize opportunity, some of the big real estate companies that organize opportunity zone funds put on their websites the projects that they've done. I did talk to Sean Parker for the book, as I said. He thinks that it's too early to condemn the program. He thinks about this the way software developers did. This was Opportunity Zones 1.0, and he thinks if there are tweaks, we should make them. The problem is that in Washington these days, it's really hard to fix something once it's made. Opportunity zones have become a bit polarized. Some people want to do away with them. Some people want to expand them. And I'm afraid that logical tweaks to the program may be very hard to get done in Washington. Turns out it's easier to get something into law than to fix it. There is, as someone points out, so on the spectrum of ways to do public policy like this, you can have so many rules and so much bureaucracy that you basically discourage all but people who are professionals in that particular tax break from taking advantage of it. Some people think the low-income housing tax credit is that it's so complicated and you have to be able to play the game that only specialists do it. And you don't get as much money into that as a result. On the other hand, at the other end, there's the no regulation. Let's just let the money flow and hope that it goes in the right place. And I think the opportunity zone people went too far in that direction. There is always a tension. You see it in almost every program in Washington between making a lot of rules so that there's never a newspaper story that says someone undeserving got the money, and having so many rules that there's a newspaper story saying that it's impossible for people who deserve the money to get it because the forms are so complicated. I do think that it's a bit disturbing that we spend so much energy trying to make sure that nobody who is undeserving gets the earned income tax credit. This is a wage bonus that the government gives people at low wages. And we're so much less scrutiny of people who are taking advantage of a capital gains tax break like this. According to that Joint Tax Committee look at the tax returns, the average person taking advantage of opportunity zones has annual income of $1.1 million a year. And that's not surprising because if you don't have capital gains, you can't play. And only 1 in 5 American households has any capital gains. Most of them don't have very big ones. And anybody who makes under about $80,000 a year in taxable income is already freed of capital gains taxes. So this is really a tax break that only the rich can play in. Let's see, I'm going to just look at these questions here for a minute. How often do schemes like this become policy that may never be covered by the press or given proper attention, in my opinion? Often, but eventually the press catches on. The problem is that it sometimes catches on too late. And so with opportunity zones, there were lots of stories after the law was passed and lots of stories about foolish choices that governors made, but there's no way under current law to undo an opportunity zone designation. So Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan, which doesn't really need much help, is an opportunity zone, but there's no way to undo that. That would take more legislation. But I think that the press does eventually catches on, and some of the waning of investigative reporting resources, as some papers have gotten squeezed, have been picked up by places like ProPublica, the nonprofit investigative journalism thing. But are there things that should be written about that aren't? Yes. Is the press too often caught up in writing about this as if it's a baseball game where it's either Team McConnell winning or Team Schumer winning, as opposed to substance? I mean, a number of people have pointed out that about the only thing anybody ever writes about the big reconciliation bill, the human capital bill that's pending in Congress, is that it's a $3.5 trillion bill, or will it be cut to $2 trillion? And there's so much stuff in it that the headline number sometimes crowds out the questions about what do we do about climate change or childcare or healthcare. There's some of that. So, yes, I think the press does a pretty good job. Does the press do a good enough job? No. Someone makes the point I made. This is an example of people complaining about the bureaucracy and then realizing you need some of that to have checks on the system. I was kind of amused that the people at the Economic Innovation Group, who never protested anything that the Trump Treasury did while President Trump was in office, only after the fact told me they were kind of disappointed with some of the moves that the Trump Treasury made. I found that rather self-serving. Again, you can put questions in the chat. I'm going to I just want to think about if there's anything. So I think that's the story I tell in the book, and I'm sad in a way that it's been a very interesting experience to have people look at the book. The proponents of opportunity zones hate the book. They think that I set out to had an axe to grind, and that they particularly don't like the idea that I found a lot of examples and generalized from them about how the program hasn't worked as they said it would. On the other hand, there are people who are much more critical of opportunity zones than me and think the whole thing is corrupt, and they're giving me a hard time for not accusing Jared Kushner of cooking this whole thing up. There was a really interesting period of time after the bill was known that some newspapers, the Times in particular, kind of talked a lot about how the Trump people around Donald Trump, including Jared Kushner, were taking advantage of opportunity zones. And the tone of those stories was that this whole thing was cooked up by Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump in order to line their own pockets. I actually don't think that's true. I think they were incidental to this becoming law. But it turns out if you pass a tax break that's particularly favorable to real estate, guess what? People around Donald Trump will take advantage of it because a lot of people around Donald Trump are into real estate. So those are the questions I had that are on opportunity. Oh, could this policy have been created under a Democratic president? Absolutely. The boys at Economic Innovation Group had the perfectly diversified portfolio. They had Cory Booker and Tim Scott. And like most people in Washington, they assumed that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Tim Scott would be the person who carried this football down the field, and he would protect it against the accusations that it was just a tax break for the rich. Cory Booker is a very business-friendly Democrat who in Newark saw the way that you could use tax incentives to get businesses to invest in the community. He was very instrumental in getting a state tax credit. But the difference there is that the land that was used for those buildings that were put up by big companies like Prudential Insurance were owned by the city. So the city had a lot of say over what the projects were, which doesn't happen with opportunity zones. And secondly, there were some conditions about employment that don't exist in opportunity zones. But I suspect that if Hillary Clinton had won and there was some big tax bill, that this might have been included in it. It had a support of a lot of Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee in the House. And as I said, it had some prominent Democrats like Cory Booker. I do think it would have been administered differently by a Clinton Treasury. There's an office at Treasury called the Community Development Financial Institutions Program that administers most tax programs like this. And that office expected to be the one to administer this program, but that didn't happen. A political appointee took control of it, a guy named Dan Kowalski, and he made all the decisions. The CDFI people were involved because they're the only ones that know how to crunch the numbers and come up with a list of census tracts. But as a result, most of the regulations are, as the experts in the field call it, taxpayer friendly, which means when they had to make a decision, they leaned on the side of the investor, not on the side of the community. Somebody has asked a question, which is not about opportunity zones, but I'm happy to talk about it. Do you have any insight into the extension of benefits or payments to people, like the extra money for households with children that came during the pandemic? Does it seem like these have been popular enough that there's a discussion on those becoming permanent? And the short answer to that is absolutely. So there is there's been for a while a program called the Child Tax Credit, which gives money to middle-class families with children. It was expanded in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So it goes further up the income ladder, and the amount of money was increased that each family gets. And then in the recent legislation, more of it was made refundable. Refundable means if you don't owe any income taxes, the government gives you cash. There used to be some limits on that, but there are no longer those limits. It's very popular with both Democrats and Republicans because kids are popular, and it has the favorable effect of lifting millions of families with children out of poverty, because if you give them cash, their income is higher. I think that there's some controversy always about this stuff. Do you trust the parents to spend the money on their kids, or will they use it for something else? And there's always a tension between, should we give people food stamps and stuff like that that they have to use for food, or Medicaid, which they have to use for healthcare, or should we just give them cash? But this program is very popular, and it's almost certain to be, it was temporary during the expansion was temporary during the pandemic, and it's almost certain to be extended in this reconciliation bill if it passes Congress. In general, this is true of opportunity zones as well as the child tax credit. Once something becomes law, it's very hard to take it out. You can tweak it, you can change the income thresholds, you can make it more or less generous, but they rarely go away. And everybody knows that. So that's why they were so eager to get this into the temporary pandemic bill, because they figured, as I think will be proven right, that the expansion will be made permanent. I think there are other things in the COVID bills that we've learned a lot about, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. One is we learned that the unemployment insurance system is a bureaucratic and technological mess, and it's very hard for the government to use it in times of a unusually quick and deep recession with lots of unemployed people, because each state has its own system, and the systems aren't very, some of them are so old they have to get retired computer programmers who know COBOL to tweak them and stuff. So I don't know if that'll change, but I think everybody is now aware that this patchwork system of unemployment insurance doesn't work very well. I do think that there's going to be really interesting when we have the next recession, which will come someday, I don't know when, as to whether we decide that it's more important just to send checks to every household and let some people who don't need it get the money, or is it better to have programs that are targeted at people who really need it? Because one thing we've learned is it's really hard to give money to people who really need it when you're trying to invent things on the fly. So the Treasury had a hard time giving money to landlords and tenants who were not paying their rent. And because the Treasury they'd never done this before. They've given money to banks, and they know how to do tax refunds, and they've gotten pretty good at sending one-time checks to households, as they've done a couple of times now. So we will have to decide in the future whether these targeted programs, which are more economically efficient if you can do them, because you're giving money to people who really need it and not to people who don't, are a good idea if the idea is to get a lot of money into the economy to end a recession. I think the other thing we learned is that fiscal policy works. This recession was much shorter. It was very deep, but it was much shorter than most people expected. And one big reason for that is the federal government pumped so much money into the economy that they cut the recession short, even though we were in this bizarre lockdown period. Anybody can come up with a bill, right? Just like Parker did. How often is a bill created? Ideas once thought up by somebody who isn't an insider, who is super wealthy. Well, look, there are lots of things that have been kicking around Washington for decades. How should we encourage Americans to save for their retirement? How can we encourage businesses to invest more in R&D? What is the right level of corporate tax to raise a lot of money for the federal government without encouraging companies to go abroad? How should you design worker training programs? And these things are kicked around. How do we change Social Security to make it sustainable? These things are kicked around in public, think tanks and academics and congressional hearings, and they percolate very slowly through the system. And someday some version of them becomes law eventually. And it's a very public process in which the The pros and cons are tested in the heat of political debate. I'm not saying that the system always produces good results, because Congress obviously compromises, and there are a lot of people who have influence who sometimes want to do things in a way that benefits them more than others. One example of something that's worked out kind of interestingly is there's a lot of stuff going, a lot of concern about something called surprise billing. That's when you go to the hospital, you discover that the anesthesiologist or the emergency room doc or the ambulance is out of network. And so you get this huge bill, and it's been a huge problem. There was a lot of agitation about it. My colleagues at Brookings did a lot of work at it, and legislation passed that fixed it. So what made this one unusual is it was solely pushed by one rich guy in the think tank he built. And although it wasn't like a secret, they had a political campaign to support it. The campaign was around the talking points and not around the specifics. So I think this was, if not unique, unusual. And it was because of their political skill and luck, it got put into the law when so many other things were going around. It didn't really get scrubbed. The technicians in Congress made some changes, and the changes made it a little easier for the IRS to administer. But the idea that there should be some requirement that you help people in the community, that was never really discussed because it wasn't done. So I would say this is unusual, but not unique. That's a good question. So I'm just pausing to see. I think I've hit all the questions that are there. Does anybody want to ask me anything else? What was it like to work for Rupert Murdoch or anything? Okay, Candace, well, I think I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Well, thank you so much, David. I was just thinking about how this story, in the barrage of news during the Trump era, I heard it and I knew about opportunity zones, but certainly didn't know the whole story. So it's interesting, post the Trump era to see all of the news about some of those things that are coming out that we should have paid more attention to at the time.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for bringing this to us. It's very interesting. I want to thank the audience as well. Thanks for your questions. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Only the Rich Can Play, I encourage you to use the link in the chat. That's going to take you to Third Place Books, and you can support that local store. So David, I hope that we can see you sometime in the future. Sounds like you'll be out here
Absolutely,
in the
yeah.
future.
I'm going to do a tour of opportunity zones in Seattle. I spent
great.
so much time in Portland, I didn't get to Seattle.
Oh yeah, well, we'd love to have you out here, and I hope that happens soon. But until then, have a great night.
Thank you all.